Whispers through the pages. In a quiet corner of Edinburgh, nestled between cobbled streets and ivy-covered walls, stood a small, second-hand bookstore called Whispers Through the Pages. It was the kind of place that smelled of ink, old paper, and forgotten memories. And it was here, one rainy afternoon in November, that Eliza Bennet met the man who would change her life. Eliza was a writer, though not a famous one. She wrote articles for travel magazines, short stories for little-known journals, and sometimes, poetry she never dared to publish. She often wandered into that bookstore searching for inspiration. That day, with raindrops trailing down the windows like tears on glass, she found something far more powerful. He was standing by the poetry shelf, flipping through a worn copy of Yeats. His coat was soaked at the shoulders, and his dark hair clung to his forehead. He looked up when he heard the bell ring above the door, and their eyes met for a moment too long to be casual. "Sorry," he said, stepping aside. "Didn't mean to block the poets." Eliza smiled. "They're patient. They've waited 100 years. They can wait a few more minutes." He chuckled, holding up the book. "I always come back to this one. There's something eternal about Yeats, don't you think?" Only everything, she said, and he smiled again, this time with something like recognition. His name was James Ashford. He was a historian, writing a book on forgotten love letters from the war, stories of people who never made it into history books. Over coffee at the cafe next door, they talked about writing, about memory, about how words could be both salvation and surrender. Time folded quietly around them, until the rain stopped and evening slipped unnoticed into night. From that day on, they met often. At first, it was coincidental, bumping into each other at the bookstore, or sharing the same table in the crowded cafe. Then it became intentional. Walks in the meadows. Late-night messages. Shared glances across busy rooms. They discovered a shared reverence for the past. Eliza loved stories that ended in hope, while James searched for beauty in those that didn't. She wrote with heart, he researched with precision. Together, they were like a poem and its footnotes, different, yet incomplete without each other. Winter passed in a blur of tea-stained pages, candlelit conversations, and the slow unraveling of their guarded hearts. By spring, they had become a quiet certainty in each other's lives. They never said I love you aloud, not yet, but it lived in every touch, every lingering gaze. One afternoon, Eliza found an envelope tucked inside one of the old books James had left at her place. Inside was a letter, written in his careful handwriting. You once told me you were afraid of writing love stories because you feared they would end. But maybe some stories are meant to keep going, even if they aren't perfect, even if they get messy. You are my favorite chapter, Eliza. And if you'll let me, I'd like to keep writing this one with you. Tears welled in her eyes as she closed the letter. She didn't call him that night. Instead, she wrote her own letter, folded it into his copy of Yeats, and waited. The next morning, he arrived with his usual coffee and nervous smile. She handed him the book. He opened it slowly, read her words, and looked up. Yes, she whispered before he could ask. Yes to all of it. From then on, life wasn't always easy. There were missed calls, rejected manuscripts, long nights of silence when words failed them. But their love was stitched together by something stronger than ease, by patience, understanding, and the quiet magic of two people choosing each other again and again. Years later, Whispers Through the Pages would become their bookstore. They bought it from the retiring owner and restored it to its old charm. In the back, they kept a special shelf, full of letters people had written and left behind, love stories tucked between the spines. Eliza's first novel was published beneath that roof. James's book followed a year later. And on rainy afternoons, they would sit behind the counter, fingers laced together, as the whispers of the past danced through the pages once more. Where the lavender grows. In the quiet countryside of Provence, nestled among rolling hills and endless fields of lavender, there lived a young woman named Elise Martin. She worked at a small family-owned inn, spending her mornings preparing breakfast for guests and her afternoons tending to the lavender gardens behind the house. Her days were peaceful, filled with the scent of blossoms and the whisper of the wind, but her heart often longed for something more, something undefined. One summer afternoon, a guest arrived at the inn. He was a writer from London, Thomas Blake, looking for solitude to finish his novel. With tousled hair, ink-stained fingers, and a soft British accent, he stood out from the usual tourists. Elise welcomed him with a polite smile, not knowing that his presence would change the rhythm of her life. At first, Thomas kept to himself, often disappearing into the hills with a notebook. But one evening, as Elise was closing the garden gate, she found him sitting beneath the old olive tree, staring at the sunset. "It's beautiful," he said, nodding to the sky. "It always is," she replied. "But it's lonelier when no one shares it." From that moment, their conversations grew. Over morning coffee and twilight walks, they shared dreams, fears, and laughter. Elise spoke of her childhood, her love for painting, and how she had given it up after her mother died. Thomas confessed he hadn't written a word in weeks, paralyzed by doubt. Slowly, their bond deepened, not with grand gestures, but with quiet understanding. One rainy afternoon, Thomas found a sketchbook in the garden shed. It was filled with Elise's forgotten drawings, portraits of nature, the village, and even a sketch of a man who looked remarkably like him. "You used to draw," he said, flipping through the pages. "I used to feel something worth drawing," she whispered. Gently, Thomas took her hand. "Then let's help each other find what we've lost." In the days that followed, their hearts bloomed like the lavender around them. Thomas began writing again, inspired by Elise's strength and beauty. Elise picked up her pencils and brushes, encouraged by his faith in her. They spent their evenings under starlit skies, creating side by side, him with words, her with colors. But as the summer waned, so did the illusion of permanence. Thomas had obligations in London. He had to leave. On their last night, he left a letter on her windowsill, tied with lavender stems. "My dearest Elise, you once said the sky is lonelier when no one shares it. So I ask, will you come share it with me in London? Not just for the sunsets, but for every moment. Yours always, Thomas." Tears fell as she read the words. She looked out at the fields, now tinged with the gold of early autumn, and knew her heart had found its place, not in the soil of Provence, but in the hand of the man who saw her fully. 2 weeks later, a train arrived in London. Stepping onto the platform with a suitcase and a sketchbook, Elise found Thomas waiting, smiling, arms wide, eyes full of love. Together, they built a life of art and words, of mornings in cozy cafes and nights beneath city lights. But every summer, without fail, they returned to Provence, where the lavender grew, and where their love first began.